Hey Vision Chasers, this is Dr. Bird here with a social studies lesson for you today. Today I'm going to talk about the causes of the Civil War, and the American Civil War to be more exact. And no, not the Civil War between Iron Man and Captain America. So the American Civil War, a war in which about over 600,000 people lost their lives fighting this war. So people on the north and in the southern part of the United States, many people were affected by this war because a lot of families lost loved ones or had loved ones who were wounded fighting this war. And so what I've done with this lesson, like I've done in many lessons before, is I've shortened it into a brief acronym. So for this lesson, I've broken it down into SCAR, S-C-A-R. The acronym is going to be very important as we go forward, and as far as helping you understand the causes of the Civil War. So we've laid that foundation, so let's get busy. For those of you who are familiar a little bit with the Civil War, you'll know that slavery was a major factor that led to this war between the North and the South. So the S in SCAR stands for slavery. The first African slaves landed in colonial territory in Jamestown, Virginia, to be exact, in 1619. Now, their main purpose was to work in the tobacco fields. Tobacco was a very, very important cash crop. And before I go on any further, it's important to mention that slavery was practiced throughout the colonies. But there was a time when the North started to move away from agriculture towards industrialization. And industrialization simply means that goods are being produced by machine. So as a result of the Revolutionary War, many southern colonies lost their tobacco markets. And so it wasn't as profitable to produce tobacco. So again, at this time, the North is starting to abolish the practice of slavery, and the South is actually thinking about it as well, until the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. Now, if you look at raw cotton, you'll notice that throughout the cotton, there are numerous seeds in the cotton. And so it is very difficult to separate the seed from the cotton, and it takes a long time to do that. But as I said before, with this invention, it is easier to separate the seed from the cotton. And so as a result, Southern states did not abolish slavery. As a matter of fact, Instead, they increased their use of slaves in order to harvest cotton. But by 1808, Congress would no longer allow people to import slaves from Africa. But because there were a number of slaves here in the United States already, the slave population would grow tremendously. For example, in 1790, there was about 700,000 slaves living in the United States. But by 1860, that number would grow to 4 million. And before I move on, I just want to show you, here on your screen, you're looking at pictures of slave plantations. Now, throughout the South, you can still visit these plantations and just really kind of just take it in. Again, history is pretty cool, and the fact that we've preserved some of these places, although, you know, the history is not so pleasant. But as a historian, I think that there is something that can be gained from, visiting these sites and trying to envision what it may have been like back then. And then think about all of the progress that's been made and how you can help to make even more progress. So that's just something to think about. The C stands for Constitution. Now, this is going to throw you for a bit of a loop, I'm sure. You're probably thinking, how did the Constitution lead to the Civil War? Well, I'm about to tell you. When the Founding Fathers were debating the Constitution, they realized that the people wanted certain protections from government. If this Constitution was going to be ratified, there were going to have to be certain rights guaranteed to everybody. That's how the Bill of Rights was born. That's why the Constitution specifically says that we have the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, freedom to petition, freedom of assembly. But also the Constitution says that rights not specifically given to the federal government are given to the states. And let me read that amendment to you. Again, that's the 10th Amendment, and it reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Now, that amendment explains why in some states marijuana is legal and in other states marijuana is not legal. It explains why some states don't have an income tax and other states do have an income tax. It explains how there is a different minimum wage depending on what state you're in. Also, there are different voting laws depending on what state you're in. So things differ based on what state you're in because of the 10th Amendment. And that amendment is very, very important. I truly believe that had that amendment not been promised to the people, then the states would not have ratified the Constitution. Also, when the Founding Fathers were debating the Constitution, they had to compromise on a couple of issues. Now, compromise simply means meet in the middle, make a deal. Neither party gets exactly what they want, but both sides can agree to give up something and they can deal with the outcome. They can live with it. And so let's talk about those two issues. The first issue that the Founding Fathers had to tackle was representation in the Congress. Now, the Congress is the lawmaking body. In the United States, there is a Senate and then there is a House of Representatives. And so they were trying to figure out, how are we going to decide how many representatives each state gets? So there were two plans. One was the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan proposed that representation in Congress should be based on the population of your state. Sounds pretty simple, right? But there was a state with a smaller amount of people than Virginia. Representatives from that state stood up and said, wait a second. We think that each state should have an equal amount of representation. So now you have a battle between the bigger states and the smaller states. The smaller states didn't want to be ran over and ruled by the larger states because nothing they proposed would ever get done because they're not as populated as those bigger states. And out of this disagreement was born the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise dictated that every state would get 2 senators in the Senate, and in the House of Representatives, representation would be based on your population. That's the Great Compromise. So you're probably wondering, how does this fit into the Civil War? Stay with me, I'm getting there. So this compromise led to another issue and then eventually a compromise that would follow. Because now the Senate was easy. They said each state should have 2 senators. That's nice and easy. But remember what I said before, the North was moving away from slavery, and so they were abolishing slavery. And the slaves were mainly, at this time, they're in the South. But remember, the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. And so the Southerners, because they want more influence in Congress, right? So they wanted to have it both ways, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to count the slaves as part of their population, therefore giving them more power in the Congress. Well, the northern states said, well, wait a second, that's not right. You can't have it both ways. And so now there was a fight between the two sides on this issue. And this is definitely a sad moment in history, what came out of this. And what came out of this was a 3/5 compromise. And what they decided was that every slave in the South counted for 3/5 of a person, not even a whole person, but just 3/5 of a person. And so, again, that's a sad piece of history. And so let's bring it full circle, because what is the Constitution? How does that lead us to civil war? That very sad fact about the three-fifths compromise, that is in direct contrast to another historical American document, and that document is the Declaration of Independence. And that document states specifically, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So my point, Vision Chasers, is this. Ultimately, slavery could not last because it was against the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution, but it sets the foundation on which this country is built upon, believing that all men are created equal. And that's why I believe it was a huge cause that led up to the Civil War between the North and the South. The A stands for abolitionist movement. Now, abolitionists, those were people who wanted to abolish, meaning to get rid of slavery. And these people really start to move and spread the word to other people that we need to get rid of slavery. Slavery is an evil thing. So the abolitionist movement began in the 1820s. Abolitionist groups, they produced newspapers, and women were a huge part of the abolitionist movement. And that's why it's so sad that once freedmen were given citizenship and the right to vote, that it excluded women. Women were not able to vote until much, much later. And that's another sad part of history. Now, Congress would try to prevent these heated arguments and tensions flaring over this issue of slavery. And they actually passed a law that said you can't talk about this issue of slavery and how it's wrong. But these abolitionists would not be silent. Abolitionists such as Elijah Lovejoy, who was murdered for expressing his opinion about slavery. These abolitionists would also violate the law. A Fugitive Slave Act actually compelled Northerners to return runaway slaves back to their owners in the South. And many of these Northerners would reject this law and nullify the law. In some instances, Northerners would rescue captured slaves from federal custody. That's how much these abolitionists believed in their movement. And John Brown was one of the most memorable abolitionists because he actually died for his cause. He tried to start an armed slave rebellion by stealing weapons from the military. Ultimately, he was unsuccessful and he was executed for his crime. But the story of John Brown was a rallying cry. It encouraged abolitionists to continue fighting against the existence of slavery in the United States. So we talked about slavery, talked about the Constitution, we talked about the abolitionist movement, and the R. The R stands for the Republican Party. The birth of the Republican Party was a major factor that led to the Civil War. And it is very important that you know and understand that it is the Republican Party that led the fight to end slavery. So the Republican Party was actually founded in 1854. Its founding members were actually part of another party called the Whig Party. Now, a group of Whigs would leave the party because they were upset by the passage of a law that would allow slavery to just spread all over the United States with no end in sight. 1860 was a presidential election year, and the Republicans would nominate, ultimately, the 16th president of the United States, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln's job was very difficult because he would win this election in November of 1860. But prior to his election, the southern states were saying that if Abraham Lincoln wins, we're out of here. We're breaking away from the Union. So just 6 weeks after Abraham Lincoln is elected president, South Carolina breaks away from the Union. After another 6 more weeks, 5 other states join South Carolina. And in April of 1861, the Civil War would begin. So there you have it. You have a number of important causes that would result in this Civil War being fought in the United States. Now, ultimately, after that war is over, there would be a lot of work towards rebuilding the country. And again, that leads us into another sad chapter of history because Reconstruction did not work as it was intended to work for a number of reasons. And so even though the freedmen, the former slaves, would be freedmen, they would be given citizenship, it would be a very long time until African Americans could really enjoy the fruits of citizenship. So it would be a long time. So think about it, because the Civil War ended in 1865, and former slaves were free, and they would really have to wait a long time. Think Martin Luther King Jr. until he starts to move in the 1950s, until things are finally done to protect African Americans, to really truly end segregation. So there would be a lot of work that needed to be done in order to truly make the United States whole again and truly heal that scar that was left by the Civil War. Well, that is our lesson for the day. I know that we really just scratched the surface of the causes of the Civil War and things that would happen as a result. And so there's just so much there, but I just want to keep these lessons really simple for you. So if you want to know more about the causes of the Civil War, check out the worksheet that's available for download that goes along with this lesson. Additionally, check the Vision Chasers website for more tips and tools to help you as you chase your vision of success. Thank you so much for watching, and until we meet again, please keep chasing the vision. Bye.